Welcome, everyone. I'm here live at Fighter's Heaven in Deer Lake, Pennsylvania. It's the former training camp of Muhammad Ali. My name is Jeff Julian. I'm a photographer. I've spent much time over the years chronicling boxing, but it all started for me here at Deer Lake when I first photographed Ali in the late 70s. So I'm here with Todd Snyder to discuss his new book, Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype. It was released today by Hamilcar Publications, and it's a biography of a larger-than-life confidant of Ali, Drew Bundini Brown. We also have with us special guest Taryn Brown, Bundini's granddaughter. We only have 100 spaces available in this Zoom event, but you can also join us live on the Hannibal Boxing Facebook page or the Fighters Heaven Facebook page. Toward the end of this event, we'll answer questions from the audience. We ask that you post them using Zoom's chat feature or Facebook's comment section. So Todd Snyder is an associate professor of English at Siena College in New York. He's also the author of 12 Rounds in Lowe's Gym, which is a really good book too. Our special guest, Taryn Brown, is a corporate lawyer out of Washington, D.C., and she's a granddaughter of Drew Bundini Brown. So, Todd, you must be excited that your Bundini book is finally out and available to the public. I know you put a lot of hard work, a lot of heart and soul into this book. I read the book, and I think it's great. It's excellent.
Thank you.
I mean, what a fascinating story, and it's really well written. You're a talented writer for sure.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. And I want to thank the Brown family, Bundini's son, Drew Brown III, Taryn, all of the family for welcoming me in and trusting me and believing in me to tell the story. It's been the honor of my writing career to chronicle the life of one of boxing's most enigmatic figures, Drew Bundini Brown.
So Todd, of all the people you could have written about, what drew you to tell the story of Drew Bundini Brown?
Well, there's a couple different things, Jeff. First of all, my father was a boxing trainer, and I grew up around boxing my whole life. And his hero was the guy right behind you, Muhammad Ali. So vicariously, Ali was my hero because I wanted to be like my dad. And my dad sort of raised me from the cradle, believing Ali was the greatest thing that ever happened to boxing. The reason my father wanted to be a boxer. And in his gym, there was a guy named Jeff Dean, who was my dad's right-hand man, who helped him train all the fighters. You know, he was the first one at the gym to help my dad, the last one to leave with my dad. And we called him Bundini Dean because he was there for everything, no matter what. He was my dad's go-to guy. And, you know, I grew up not only just loving Ali, but recognizing that, you know, to be great, you got to have people in your corner. And growing up the son of a boxing trainer, I've realized how important it is to have someone in your corner who would tell you the hard truth, who won't sugarcoat it, who will be there for you when you're down and be there, you know, for you when you win too. And I just grew up being fascinated by the guy. And I'm also today, I'm a professor and I teach classes on hip hop culture. And I've always felt like Bundini had a claim to that world as well.
Yeah.
You know, he coined the famous phrase, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. And in some ways, Ali was the sort of the foundational figure for hip hop culture in so many different ways. And Bundini was his go-to guy, his sidekick, all the way through, you know, his trainer, his motivator. And I always felt like when you would read these fantastic Ali books, there just wasn't enough about Drew in there. And he was a mysterious, shadowy figure. And because I loved hip hop so much, part of what I loved about Ali was Bundini. So when the opportunity came up, it was once in a lifetime opportunity. I wasn't going to turn it down.
I know personally, I learned a lot about Bundini I never knew about in the book.
Yeah, and you met the guy.
Where did he get the nickname Bundini? I know Ali always pronounced it Boudini.
Yeah, you know what? I have been told by the people who are close to Muhammad Ali and to Drew that if you say Bodini, that's how they know you're in the inner circle.
Yeah.
That's how Ali said it. Yeah. And I still can't trick myself into saying it that way. You know, if you really want to look cool, like you know the guy, it's Bodini is how you say it.
Yeah, Bodini.
The story is amazing, actually. When Drew was little, he grew up in Sanford, Florida. And it was a very difficult time to grow up a black man in Sanford, Florida. We're talking Jim Crow South. We're talking the presence of the KKK loomed large in Seminole County at that time. And really the turning point of his life was when the naval base was formed in Sanford. And at 13 years old, he signs up to join the Navy pretending to be 18. He lies about his age. And that journey takes him around the world. And he's actually in a port in India. And he was a good looking guy. He had a nice suit on and he was dressed up. And the girls at the port were hollering, Bundini, Bundini. And apparently it meant lover, or it meant, I have some friends who speak the language, something to that effect. We'll just say lover. And they were saying it because they thought he was handsome. And a couple of the officers heard the girls calling that to him. So for the rest of his tour, he was Bundini Brown, or Bodini Brown, if you say it.
You know, so many labels have been given to him. Hype man, corner man, motivator, court jester, Svengali. What do you think would be the best term?
You know what? Everyone I talked to for this book, and boy, did I get to talk to some amazing people. I mean, not only did I work with the Brown family, I got to talk to George Foreman, Larry Holmes, Ernie Schaefer's, Tim Witherspoon, Angelo Dundee's son, Jim, all these people who are around, you know, in the entourage. And basically the word that always came up was spirit. He was his spirit coach or his motivator. But the word spirit always showed up. And when I interviewed Kalia Ali, Ali's second wife, she said he was Ali's spirit. He was there to pick his spirits up, to wake him up for road work in the morning, to motivate him when he was having a tough day in the gym, to be that voice in the corner whenever the fight wasn't going Ali's way, to sort of keep his spirit in the game. Now, maybe some people will call it something different. Teddy Atlas and a lot of trainers have said much of boxing's mental. You know, it's the mental side of the game. But in some ways, I think spirit coach is a great term. I don't think it's a bad way. I kind of like that, actually.
Taryn, how do people react when you tell them you're Bundini's granddaughter?
They absolutely love it, and they're shocked. One reason is because I don't tell people this until I know them much later on, and usually it doesn't even come from me. It'll come from one of my friends who just cannot wait to tell them I'm Bundini's granddaughter. And what's amazing about it is that no matter who I tell, no matter what part of the world they're from, when I used to at least live in Tokyo, Japan as a basketball coach, or if here in the United States or in Europe, but no matter where I am and the age of somebody, everyone knows Ali, knows my grandfather, at least his phrase. When I explained that he the phrase float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and they're just in awe and they're amazed, and they immediately tell me their Ali story or Bundini story.
Todd, in the course of your research for the book, did you discover anything in particular that really surprised you?
Absolutely. One of the things that I really learned early on that I wouldn't have known had I listened to documentaries or watched the movies was Bundini was a very spiritual man. His favorite subject was God. He called God Shorty. And
yeah, why was that?
He believed God was for the little guy. He was for the person who was down and out, the least. And we would think of the Sermon on the Mount. God is for the person who is weak. God is for the person who's at the bottom of the barrel. He's for the one who doesn't have all the advantages. And that was sort of his worldview, that Shorty looked out for the little guy. That was his personal phrase for God. And I knew that he was a great motivator. I knew that he was charismatic. I knew that the guy had to know a whole lot about boxing, being around Sugar Ray and Muhammad Ali. But I didn't know how spiritual of a man he really was. And one of the blessings of doing this research is I got to read his personal writings. I got to read he had started some books and he had wrote some plays and he had written poems. They're all about God, or they're all about his concept of Shorty. And he was way deeper than people ever imagined. He was a philosophical guy. So that was something I wouldn't have guessed coming into the research, but immediately it jumped out at me that this was someone who was very spiritual, very in tune with the higher power.
Interesting. Taryn, you were about 10 years old when your grandfather died. What are some of your favorite memories of him?
One of the memories that, I think that it just rings true most for me and my family is when my dad got his wings of gold to be a pilot in the Navy. So once you complete all those training and those hours in the Navy of flying jets off the aircraft carriers at night, you get pinned a wings of gold as in a ceremony. And it's a very special ceremony. It's very big. My dad, is only one of the only, if not the only, Black Navy jet pilot at the time. And at this ceremony, my dad really wanted my grandfather to be there. And he was just so, that's what he wanted more than anything, obviously, other than having us there. He wanted my grandfather to be there. And my grandfather was so nervous and scared to come because when, as I mentioned earlier, he got kicked, he was in the Navy, but he got kicked out for calling, for a man calling him the N-word. And when the man called him the N-word, he actually threw the man over the aircraft. So subsequently, instead of he got kicked out, which, I understand why he did that. But he was so nervous to come to my dad's pinning ceremony because he didn't want, the Navy to perhaps look up that story and then, prevent my dad from getting his gold wings. But he showed up, he came, my dad was just ecstatic and so proud of him. And then I found out later that he actually went up to the admiral at the ceremony. My grandpa went up to the admiral at the ceremony and he said, well, guess what? You guys can't call me the N-word anymore. And the admiral's like top. And the admiral looked at him and smiled and he knew exactly, what he was talking about, where he was coming from with that. And they talked for an hour after that and became friends, of course, as my grandfather does.
Yeah.
Wow. Bundini worked with two of the greatest fighters in the history of boxing, Sugar Ray Robinson, Muhammad Ali, but he never really had experience in boxing before that. What was it about him that brought him together with those two great fighters? How'd that happen?
Yeah, that was interesting to me. I knew a little bit about the Navy stuff and the story that Taryn just shared. There's versions of that out there in the world. So I'd heard some of that. So I just assumed that the guy learned to box in the Navy. And when I met Bundini's son, that was one of the first things that he straightened me out about. He said, my father didn't have an athletic bone in his body. He said he watched him try to play softball at a family reunion once and he held the bat the wrong way. And he said, I'll never forget, Drew said, the only time I ever saw my dad run was in Shaft, the great Gordon Park movie. And, he wasn't a fighter, although he had a brother, Filbert, in Florida, who he did kind of help him a little bit in boxing, and he had worked his corners at the amateur level. But really, he was someone who didn't have an extensive boxing background. How he gets hooked up with Sugar Ray Robinson is, after the Navy career and after his time in the Merchant Marines, which takes him around the world as well, he ends up in Harlem. And he ends up on the same block that Sugar Ray Robinson sort of redeveloped. And if you do your research on Sugar Ray, he was a heck of an entrepreneur. He wasn't just a resident in Harlem, he was a proprietor. And he built Sugar Ray Golden Gloves Barbershop and laundromats and a women's clothing store and a club and a restaurant. Well, Bundini lived on the block where Sugar Ray owned all that real estate. And one day he walks into Sugar Ray's barbershop to get his hair done and he meets Johnny Honeyboy Bratton, former welterweight champion. And they get into this funny exchange where Bratton's trying to convince Bundini that he was a champion boxer and he's a real pretty boy like Sugar Ray. And Bundini says, no way you were a fighter. Where's your scars at? I don't believe it. So Johnny Bratton says, come to the gym and I'll show you. And they said Bratton really lit into his sparring partner that night. And one of Bratton's friends said, hey, we need to have this guy around. He motivated you to go to there and look great. So him and Bratton form a friendship, which leads to him and Sugar Ray becoming very good friends. And he was with the great Sugar Ray Robinson for 7 consecutive years. And at the end of Sugar Ray's career, right before Ali's fight with Doug Jones, he sort of passes the baton and says, if you want to be great like me, champ, I've got the guy that can help you do it. And so he sort of gives Bundini to Ali as sort of a gift, as sort of the passing of the baton of the great champions in boxing. And, there's no way that a guy could spend 7 years with Sugar Ray Robinson and 20 plus years with Muhammad Ali and not really know boxing. I mean, he didn't have a professional boxing background, but what better education could you get than, Sugar Ray Robinson, Muhammad Ali, and let's not forget, He also worked with George Chuvalo and a number of other fighters like Quick Tillis. He worked with him for a couple fights. So he was a guy who knew his boxing too. No doubt about it.
What made him such a motivator? Where did that come from?
You know where I think it comes from, Jeff, is I think he was a survivor. He came out of extremely difficult, tough circumstances in Florida. He had very difficult, tough circumstances in the Navy. I mean, he had to fight his whole life. Even in his early days in Harlem, life wasn't so easy. He was a fighter, and he knew how to motivate people because he knew what it was like to be down and out. I think he was in touch with his own emotions. And I think the best coaches understand that. They're in tune with how people tick. He could read people like most of us could read books. This guy was just special. He had a gift. And it was a blessing for me to kind of dig into his philosophies and show how they, show up in some of Ali's most famous moments in his career. Because, as Rockman said in his recent book, Ali may have had 3 or 4 more losses on his record if it wasn't for the guy in his corner, Bundini Brown.
Taryn, what do you think made him such a motivator? You think it was his upbringing, his life experiences, or combination?
This is such a great question. And I think it stems from 2 things. One, I do think it stems from his belief in Shorty and God, and having that deep spiritual connection, and that coming through as very genuine. And also his love for people. And when you love people, you see the best in them. And then when you see the best in people, you can also help them see the best in themselves, even when they're maybe aren't feeling the best about themselves, even when they're scared, or even when they're in the middle of a fight and they want to quit. You help them to get over that hump. And I think he had the gift, and he was able to do that with the 2 greatest fighters in the world, and helped them become world champions because of that reason. But I think that stems from him not seeing the world in conventional terms, and breaking outside the mold, and helping other people see themselves in that way as well. A lot of people know about the Liston fight, where it's it's the ultimate in motivation, when Ali he got hit by Liston, I believe it's like Ben Gay, on the glove. And he couldn't see, and he goes back to the ring, and he tells my grandfather, he's like, I take my gloves off. You got to cut my gloves off. I'm done. I can't see. I'm blind. And my grandfather pulls out pictures, I believe, of like his family, and of the Champ's family, and the other people. And he's like, Champ, you're not fighting for yourself anymore. You're fighting for the people. Like, you get back out there, and this isn't about just you. And that's, of course, he said in much more motivating terms than that, but he goes out there and he wins. And so it's even when people are down and out, like, that's when the true motivators come, with the spirit, through Shorty, or, somewhere, and they help people see things in themselves that, that they're not able to see.
Yeah, I want to jump in. I think the term we used in the book was the ultimate optimist. And his belief, his optimism came from his belief in God. And some of his best work, in my opinion, comes from those down and out moments. I think Taryn's exactly right. When Ken Norton breaks Ali's jaw, it's the speech that Bundini gives him in the hospital. He says, Champ, this is going to make you so much greater, because now they're all going to doubt you. So when you get the belt back, you're going to be bigger than you ever were. So he knew how to touch you when things weren't going your way. It's easy to motivate someone when they're winning an easy fight. His best work was when Ali was up against the ropes. And, like I said in our documentary, maybe his best magic trick was Zaire with Big George. He did some of his best motivating, getting Ali spiritually ready for that fight.
Ali actually fired Bundini multiple times over the years, but always brought him back. What was it that made them click? What was their relationship like?
Yeah, I want to say this for the folks who haven't read the book. Their relationship is a lifelong friendship. And, I think it was Kalia who told me they were Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. They were little boys. They loved each other. They were ornery together. But at the same time, they had their moments of friction, and they had their falling out. And we tried to chronicle those tough times too. Here's the reality. Gene Kilroy told me, Ali's longtime business manager, said he had watched Ali in the gym, right where you are, Jeff. with Bundini and without him, and he was just so much better with him. He said when he would, they would have to fire Bundini over whatever the tiff was at the time. He said, I would wait for Ali to be in a good mood. And then I would say, gee, champ, don't you think it's quiet around here? Shouldn't we call Drew and get him back? And he said that was his way of saying, like, we're in trouble. You're not working hard enough. We got to get it back. And, they had their battles over the years, but they were friends for life. I mean, it's touching. You look at the picture behind it that you took, Jeff. I mean, it looks like a father tying his son's shoes. There was real love between those guys, even though they had their spats for sure.
And they were still close at the time of Bundini's death?
Yeah, they were still close. It was a tough time for both guys for sure, though. Ali was really starting to feel the effects of Parkinson's, and Drew was in sort of a tough place in his life too. The circus was over, the journey was over, and both guys had this sort of a reimagined life after boxing. Drew was doing some movies, that kind of thing, but they did stay friends right to the very end. And one of the more touching stories I heard was from Victor Solano, who was there with Ali when he visited Drew before he passed. And that excerpt was in Ring Magazine this month, and it's a touching story. I mean, you could feel the real love between those guys, that even though they had their ups and downs, I mean, they were a team to the very end, even when things were bad for both of them there at the
end. Yeah, I'll add to the firing piece. Thinking about this, when someone with Hamilcar Publishing came up with the phrase, "Who's your Bundini?" Yeah. I mean, who's the person who motivates you and is going to be honest with you and tell you the truth, no matter what, even if it makes them maybe not put in the best light. And so when someone is a Bundini, they are telling you things that are hard, that you don't sometimes like to hear, but for your best interest, and sometimes that gets you fired. Or they don't do things that they maybe I think that the Muslims at the time wanted my grandfather to do, and that will get you fired. But when you stand your conviction, when you are who you are, and you're telling someone something that's the best for themselves, but maybe not the best for you, and it doesn't make you a yes man, please people because of it, that will get you fired. Yeah. But as Todd said, if you're not as good with the person right next to you, you're going to bring them back, and then you find out later on, like, oh, right now, see, they were taking up, Bundini was taking up for me, like he cared about me.
Yeah, she's absolutely right. I think incorrectly, there's been a lot of people write about him and say, oh, he was a cheerleader, a yes man. If he was a yes man, he wouldn't have been fired so many times. When he didn't agree with something that Elijah Muhammad was saying, he would tell Ali. And that, there wasn't a lot of guys in the entourage who were doing that. They were just kind of letting the champ do what the champ wanted to do. But he stood his ground to a fault, maybe to his own, for his own fault. But he told him what he believed in, what he thought was right. And that's why he always was brought back, because, Ali was a level of famous that most of us could never imagine. And it's nice to have a little touch of reality, someone who's going to be real with you and honest with you. I love that phrase, who's your Bundini, because that's absolutely what I want this book to do for people. I want people to read it and think about, who is the person in your life that does this? Is it a teacher? Is it a your husband, your wife, your kids, a family member, a coach maybe? Like, who's the person that does that for you? Because, I mean, Ali could box before he ever met Bundini, but that friendship took him to a new level. That partnership took his career to a new plateau for sure. We all got a Bundini, or maybe multiple Bundinis, Taryn.
I like that, yeah. You spent a lot of time interviewing Bundini's son, Drew III, your father, Taryn. What kind of father was Bundini?
Yeah, okay, I'll jump in, and then I want to hear Taryn's 2 cents on this too. That was my favorite part of learning about Bundini. I honestly mean that. That's from my heart. Is I wanted to tell this book through the eyes of his son, because boy, was he a proud father. You got to think, he gets kicked out of the Navy, but he was treated pretty badly there. At those times, the Navy was, had some pretty racist policies, and Black folks who were in the Navy basically were servants. And then what does his son do? He becomes a black fighter pilot one day. And he was so proud of his boy. And as you know, Jeff, Ali didn't like to fly. So he would tease the champ and say, you don't even like to fly on planes. My boy, he flies them himself, He was a super proud dad. And even though he and his wife, Rhoda Palestine, divorced, they always stayed together from most of Drew's childhood as well. And that bond and that love was there too. And, you know, another character who I loved writing about was Rhoda, who was, you know, came from a completely different background than Drew did. You know, Drew came from Sanford, Florida. Rhoda's parents were Russian immigrants who fled, you know, the anti-Semitic stuff that was happening in Europe at the time to come to Brighton Beach, New York. And Rhoda was this sort of interesting figure to me. She had this sort of Orthodox Jewish background, but she was a rebel and she was a poet and she read philosophy and she loved jazz. And she sneaks away when she's young and they meet in a jazz joint. And that romance, that love affair was one of my, you know, one of the most fun things to write about. And I wouldn't have been able to tap into that if not for Drew. You know, he was there giving me the stories about both of his parents. It was so fun here. I enjoyed that more than anything, more than the boxing stuff.
Would you agree, Taryn, with Todd's characterization of Bundini as a father?
Yeah, absolutely. I think he was, and my dad always says he's the, you know, had unconditional love and showed so much affection for my dad. And he said, which is crazy because, you know, his dad didn't show that affection towards granddaddy Drew. So, but he was just the most affectionate, loving person. My dad's the same way. And, you know, and granddaddy Drew was also unwavering about education when it came to my dad and our family. And that was like one of the preeminent things that was always discussed. It wasn't, you know, if you're going to college, but when you're going to college. And it's something my grandfather just, you know, drilled into my dad's head, along with my grandmother, of course. And he also put pressure on my dad to be better than him. And you know, which was always, you know, daunting for my dad, because he's like, my dad's on Sports Illustrated. He, you know, is next to the, you know, the greatest, most famous person in the world. And how am I going to be better than my dad? And before my grandfather died, he did tell my dad, he's like, son, you know, he told him, he's like, son, you know, you did it. You've surpassed me in so many ways. You know, you're greater than me. And yeah, I think that, you know, I would have learned, and I didn't know this at the time until like this book started, until the Todd has uncovered so much with this book, and it just got our family talking again. But you know, my dad and my mom, they are like the consummate teachers. Like, you know, they're always teaching me things, and my brother things. They're always passing on lessons, and that stems directly from my grandfather. My grandfather's like a consummate teacher. He's, you know, through motivating, you're also teaching. And it's just something that, you know, not a day goes by for talking to my dad that he's not going to teach you something, you know, or teach what political thing he saw or something, because there's some lesson in everything. And that stems directly from my grandfather. So I think that's one of the big takeaways from his, from being raised by him.
Bundini was a proud daddy. You don't have to dig very far into the research to know he bragged on his son, and then that's in a multitude of Ali books. He's always bragging on his boy. And I liked pulling out the human side of him because he's such a larger than life character. And I felt like, for me, I wanted to make him human again. I wanted to make him a man. I wanted to show the women he fell in love with. I wanted to show him with you, Taryn, when you're a little girl. I wanted to show those stories that make people see Bundini as a man, not just an icon. And he's certainly an icon in boxing and pop culture. But I wanted to bring out that human side, and the family connections were partially how I was able to do that, I think.
His son says in your book that some of the happiest times of his father's life was here at Deer Lake with the whole Ali team. Can you tell us anything about that? Any stories or?
Yeah, you know, this is well known about Drew as well, is that he was a street entrepreneur. You know, he sold a lot of Float Like a Butterfly t-shirts and hats and pins and stuff up at Fighters Heaven, you know, Deer Lake. And when Drew wasn't in high school, that was like his summer camp. You know, he would sit there and he would run the table, and when people would come up to watch Ali train, he would sell the merchandise for his dad, who was working with the champ. And, you know, he befriended mostly the sparring partners. He was big friends with Larry Holmes and some of the guys who, you know, less people were wanting their autograph and pictures at the time. So those are like his big brothers. And he was there and he said some of the best fights no one's ever seen between Holmes and Ali, and right where you're at right now. So It was very fun to go, and one of the blessings of doing this research is coming down there and getting to see the reconstruction process. I mean, it's like walking back into history. It was one of the most unbelievable things I've ever done. It's like just taking a step into an old Ali documentary and seeing it, you know, up close and personal. I've been to the Ali Museum in Louisville, and it's wonderful, but Fighter's Heaven is like really being there. And I couldn't have written that chapter about Fighter's Heaven without walking those grounds and meeting you guys.
It's mentioned that he had several Brown family reunions here at the camp. Taryn, have you heard of those stories, or do you know anything about that, Todd? Or?
I've always heard about the camp in Pennsylvania and Deer Lake. I know when I was born, there was a big celebration there for me. So yeah, I've heard about that, but our family hasn't, like, meeting myself, my husband, my daughter, we haven't gone to Fighters Heaven yet. We plan to go as soon as, and do another maybe family reunion there. We would love to.
We've been told that at one time, before all these individual cabins were built, that Bundini and Ali's trainer, Angelo Dundee, both shared one of the bunkhouses, one of the buildings. Do you know what their relationship was like, Todd?
Yeah, you know, when I got to talk to Angelo's son for the book, I was so ready to hear some dirt on Bundini. I thought, okay, this is going to be the interview where I hear about the friction they had. This is the interview where they're going to talk about those guys butting heads in the corner. Because my dad was a boxing trainer and he liked a quiet corner. He did not like a lot of talking. My dad was the only one who talked. And I worked hundreds of fights with my dad and I didn't say a word. I just stayed on the, get the mouthpiece out. And that was not the case at all. I mean, Angelo absolutely got a kick out of Drew. And to be honest, his son said to me, my dad really didn't like giving speeches. So he kind of let Drew run that part of it. He was more of a strategy guy. He was more X's and O's boxing guy. And he did give some famous speeches. You know, he tells Sugar Ray, you're blowing it, kid, and all those great speeches. But he said, that really wasn't my dad. And he said they were great friends. And this was a good story. He said that Bundini took Angelo to the Cotton Club for the first time. So they had their own little adventures away from Ali. And apparently Angelo went to the premiere of Shaft too. So, you know, those guys had their own friendship. They were best buddies too. I'm sure when he brought Drew in, Angelo was a little worried because, you know, Drew is a character, but it was a great friendship there too. And I think a lot of people would guess that they butted heads, but really his son said to me and my dad were super close. And he never, ever said a bad word about Bundini. He really loved what he gave to Ali and he recognized it and appreciated it. And he said his dad was never big on being called head trainer. It didn't matter who the head trainer was or who the assistant trainer was. He basically said we were all spokes in a wheel. And this is all, we're all trying to help the champ be the best he can be. And they all brought different things to the table.
What role did Judaism come to play in Bundini's life?
Yeah, well, he marries Rhoda Palestine, who comes from an Orthodox Jewish family.
Yeah.
I don't know if you were to call Bundini a traditional Jewish man, that probably would be a stretch. He did wear the Star of David necklace around his neck during fights. He loved talking about Shorty. He loved religious services. He took his son to all different kinds of religious services when he was young. You know, his son was raised a Jewish man. He had a bar mitzvah and he spent time in Israel in a kibbutz. So his son was raised a Jewish man, and Bundini sometimes in publications would refer to himself that way. But, you know, he was certainly had his own concept of God, his own spirituality that was sort of his own. He believed in one God and he called him Shorty. But, you know, him being affiliated with that side of the fence did get him in a little trouble with the Nation of Islam in those early days of him joining Ali's team. Because you got to remember, that's right when Ali converts and changes his name. And, you know, there was talk of even replacing Angelo, as you mentioned earlier. You know, Ali, he was symbolic of that movement. And Bundini kind of broke some of the rules of the Nation of Islam. It's been well documented, I think. I don't know if Taryn wants to speak to that.
Yeah, no, I think also, when my dad was bar mitzvahed and, he's like, my son's Jewish, I'm Jewish. He wants to be whoever his son and his grandma Rhoda, what they are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, just the spirituality of he takes in all, spiritual paths. And if it's Jewish, it's Jewish. If it's, something else, it's something else. They would always, like, as Todd said, they would go to different churches and mosques and, synagogues. They would pray in all of them. And so it's, he wanted to be with his son and be Jewish like his son.
Yeah. Taryn, what do you think your grandfather's biggest contribution was to the sport of boxing?
I think it goes to his motivational prowess, like we said before, and getting to coaching two and motivating two amazing fighters and great fighters to be champions. It's just being with the two best in the world, still considered the best in the world, and bringing, just bringing that depth and spirituality to the sport, and just, I think, showing that no matter where you come from, you come from Stanford, Florida, raised around the Ku Klux Klan, your mom abandoned you, you can still go into boxing, you can go into a sport, and you can be somebody, and you can accomplish, certain things and be successful. I think that's a lot of boxing. A lot of people in boxing have that story. They don't come from the most ideal, what people would think of as the most ideal backgrounds, but they become champions, or they become part of a team, or they become somebody in the ring. And I think that's one of the great lessons.
So where did the famous phrase "float like a butterfly, sting like a bee" come from?
There's this great, if you get on YouTube or Google it, there's this great episode of Ali's This Is Your Life, where, that old game show they used to do
right.
In your past. And they let Drew tell the story of float like a butterfly, sting like a bee on that show. And I love this story so much. He said one day Ali was doing road work, and he said he was talking to Shorty. And he said, I don't talk to Shorty with my mouth, I talk to him with my mind. And he said, he asked him, he said, God, all the great champions have nicknames like Rocky Marciano, The Rock, all these, legendary nicknames. What's his nickname going to be? And he said, Shorty told him, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. And he said it just came to him. So when Ali came back from road work, that was the new phrase. And they came up with the whole shtick they did before the Liston fight.
Right.
I mean, I think it didn't just change boxing history. It changed pop culture history. Because, when I was doing my hip hop class here at Siena College, we had Chuck D from Public Enemy, the famous hip hop star from the 80s. He said to me, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee is the very first rap lyric ever. That's where it starts, right there. And I think Bundini, if that's the case, then, it starts with that lyric right there.
Wow.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Besides all the years he was involved in boxing, in the boxing world, he had quite an interesting life outside of boxing. I mean, he was well known in Harlem. He owned a popular bar there. He knew a lot of famous celebrities. Even acted in a couple movies, a couple Shaft movies, and Spielberg's Color Purple.
Let's think about this. The Shaft movies, let's think about those as a piece of iconography. They were the first Black directed films with all Black cast and with soul music on the soundtrack to go number one on the, in the box office. Bundini's in both of those movies. Those are the first. And that opens the door for hip hop too. Because, a lot of white audiences were going to see those films, and it gave studios and record companies a little bit of, feeling of, hey, we can tell stories this way. So, he knew everyone. He knew Richard Roundtree, who was Shaft. He knew Gordon Parks, who was a famous photographer and director. Back in his jazz joint days, he ran around with, Billie Holiday. He ran around with Miles Davis. He knew James Baldwin, who was one of my heroes. I mean, Khalil Ali said to me, you wouldn't believe the amount of people Bundini introduced Ali to. He said he knew everybody. And, everyone I would interview, they would always have a story about how they met Bundini before they met Ali. So he just popped up everywhere somehow. For instance, when I interviewed George Foreman, I assumed that the first time George met Bundini was in Zaire or getting ready for that fight. Well, heck, he knew Bundini 5 years before that. They were buddies. They were friends. And one of the reasons Bundini almost got fired was that he would pal around with George Foreman, when he beat Frazier. So, he was a guy who was in the know. And think about it. He was in Steven Spielberg's The Color Purple. He worked with Spielberg. He worked with Ali. He worked with Sugar Ray. I mean, he was in a Superman comic book. What crazier life could you possibly have? You couldn't make it up if you tried. And I think you could write a book on Bundini, and even the pre-Ali stuff was an amazing journey. If it would have ended with Sugar Ray, that's worthy of a book itself. Then he goes on the most amazing roller coaster ride ever with Ali. What a life! What an American original he was.
That's for sure.
Yeah, nobody like him, and there'll never be another one.
Taryn, do you feel that Todd's book captured your grandfather's life and legacy? What do you feel?
I do. I admittedly, I haven't finished the entire book yet. And in some way it's on purpose because it's so good. Every time I could start crying. I was like, I'm gonna get through this whole interview without crying, but because when you read it, it's so beautiful, and it just tells this story, the good and the bad of our family and our legacy, and it's enlightening, it's empowering to me. It makes me so proud of my grandfather, and I get to know him in ways I never knew, I never understood, especially because you're so young, and when you're young and you grew up with a famous grandfather, or it's just your grandfather. You hear about stories through your dad, and even towards the end of our life, towards the end of his life, he wasn't as around as much, and he told my dad it's because he wanted us to see him in the best light, and not see him when he was starting to fall off, and not be on his best legs, and so seeing, I don't have as many vivid impersonal memories, so just reading about it, here I go again crying, but reading Todd's book, it just shows my grandmother and my grandfather in a light in which I'm grateful that he captured. I think it's a beautiful story for for everyone to read, and for anyone looking for motivation themselves, or looking just at how two people can see the world, and see the world through different eyes, and look to include everyone. And they were just a very inclusive people, and they saw people for people. And I think Todd he captures that. He captures my grandfather and my grandmother's spirit and essence. And then to me, it makes me grateful, and it's one of the best things to happen, I think, to my life and to my family's life. And there's been a lot of good things that's happened to my life. So I've had a lot of, wins. And I think this is honestly one of the best things that could have happened to our family, is having Todd write this book.
Oh, thank you.
Todd, how much time did it take you researching for the book?
Oh my gosh.
What did you personally take away from studying this man's life?
This was the most intense research project I've ever been a part of. It was a lot of history. If I were to tally it up, probably over 130 interviews.
Wow.
I read every Ali book I could get my hands on, every Sugar Ray article or book I could get my hands on. And even wanted to talk to folks like you, Jeff, who had just met him a couple times or knew him, casually. I tried to get as many stories as I could to round out the picture so we could really see, who the man was. Working with the families that was the big thing for me, is getting close with the families and having them trust me. And Drew and I became great friends, his son. And, he's a big-hearted guy too. He tells you he loves you every time you hang up with him. He's a big-hearted guy, just like his dad. And, we'll have that bond forever now, because we went through this journey. Drew had to relive his life with me, and that's not an easy thing to do. His kids went on, Taryn and her brother, Drew, have done amazing things with their life. And, even Gene Kilroy said to me, Drew Brown III, I should be writing the book on him. Look, he was a college basketball player, a fighter pilot, a motivational speaker. He had a best-selling book back in the day too. And, all of that comes from Bundini's philosophies. And he loved his family. Wasn't perfect, but boy, his love was perfect. He sure did love his family. And it was cool getting to be a part of that circle. I'll always be in debt to those guys for that, for sure.
I don't know if we have some viewers that want to send in questions. We welcome them.
Yeah, please pass them along.
Okay, we got one here, Todd. What surprised you most when writing the book?
Yeah, there were a lot of surprises for sure. I would say the biggest surprise for me was the level in which Bundini was a philosopher. I knew he had a great tongue. I knew he was a rhymer. I knew he could come up with all the great sayings. He nicknamed everything. You know, he called the jab the yardstick. He had all these funny little sayings, and I knew that going in. But I didn't anticipate how deep he was. And when I got to read his personal writings and read how deep he was into philosophy and his idea of Shorty and God, that was intense. And I'm not even going to lie to you. I borrow some of those philosophies and try to use them in my life now. And here's one I really loved. He called road work filling up the gas tank. And anyone who knows boxing, that's getting up and do your running in the morning. That's the least fun part about being a boxer, is doing those 5-mile runs at 5 a.m. And for Bundini, he would say, you know, when you get out of bed, it's getting the gas. So you have that gas in the tank in the 15th round. And he would tell Ali, how you get out of bed in the morning says everything. And he didn't mean physically. He means the mindset, you know, and a lot of being happy is having the right mindset. And every day I get out of bed, when I'm having a bad day, I say, I got to fill the gas tank. Come on now. Like, got to get out of bed like a champ. And that's what he would tell Ali when he would get him up in the morning. So, you know, I didn't anticipate the philosophy. This book is in some ways, it feels like a motivational kind of text that you can take these life lessons and apply them to whatever you do. You know,
there's a lot of inspiration in this book. Definitely.
He was a wild dude for sure, but man, his philosophies are useful. And I try to use them in my own daily life as well. You know, he had some great ways of looking at life. He was an ultimate optimist, that's for sure.
What was the real story about the championship belt? Can you shed any light on?
I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah, you know, a lot of this conversation comes from the film that was made back in 2000, the Michael Mann film with Will Smith and Jamie Foxx. Look, anytime you go watch a movie, you know it says based on a true story. You know you're getting the Hollywood version of real life events. That movie sort of created this narrative that all Bundini ever did was steal Muhammad Ali's championship belt and sell it, you know, to a pawn shop. What really happened was there was a time right after Ali beat Liston in the rematch where there was some pressure from the nation to sort of either Bundini was going to convert or clean up his act or he was out. And Ali fired him. And Bundini was very, very hurt by that. And they withheld his paycheck for the fight. So he took a hammer and he knocked the stones out of the belt and tried to pawn the stones. The reason he had the belt was that Ali gave it to him. You know, I talked to Kalia about that. Ali really wasn't a materialistic person.
No, he wasn't. No.
He, you know, she said one time for Valentine's Day or something, she gave him a Louis Vuitton luggage suit, you know, all kinds of luggage stuff, Louis Vuitton. And he gave it to a friend. He didn't use it one time. And she was like, I was so hurt, you know, that he did that. So when he won the belt, he had given it to Drew as a present, as a gift for helping him beat Liston. Yeah, they were hurt. They were mad at each other. It wasn't that they were best buddies and he snuck around and did that. They were in a bad shape at the time. And if you know your boxing history, Customato tried to bring Bundini over to Patterson's camp for the Ali Patterson fight. And Patterson wouldn't do it because he thought he was a spy. He said, no, we can't trust this guy. He's with Ali, you know. He didn't believe they were really beefing. He thought it was cooked up. But it wasn't cooked up because in Ali's next fight, he fights George Chuvalo. And Bundini does work Chuvalo's corner. That's how hurt Bundini was. He worked Chuvalo's corner for that fight. I'm sure it was a difficult thing for both guys to forgive each other. He didn't necessarily steal the belt and sell it to a barber. Some of the stuff that's out there is kind of mythology. But yeah, there was a thing over the belt that caused some waves between the two guys. And, you know, Bundini was back in the corner before long, so he must not have been too mad about it. He brought him right back. So what's that tell you?
Someone asked, what was the most difficult chapter for you to write?
Oh my goodness. The most difficult chapters for me, I'm going to kind of talk about a few here, were the chapters where I had to talk boxing. Because I have stories about Bundini no one's ever heard but the family. I have stories about Rhoda Palestine no one's ever read. I've got stories about Bundini's son no one knows. But everybody knows how the Thriller in Manila goes. Everybody knows how the Rumble in the Jungle goes. So my goal was, I want to tell these historical events from Bundini's eyes. So I had to describe the fights. I had to write about the fights, but I knew going into that I couldn't get carried away. That's not an Ali book. It's about Drew, and everybody who's a boxing fan knows what's going to happen. So how do I keep you interested in a fight where you know what's going to happen? Well, the way I was able to do that is to tell it through Bundini's eyes. For instance, in the Rumble in the Jungle, you think, there's no friction there. Bundini's there for Ali, but him and Foreman were already friends. And he had to go in there and talk trash to his buddy. And I talked to George and it hurt because they were buddies. So, when you see the Rumble in the Jungle, knowing that there was sort of this friendship triangle where Bundini was kind of torn between both guys, you see it different. And one of my favorite stories, and I'd never read this before, is that Drew went to Foreman's locker room after the fight and said, Shorty told me you'll be the champ again. Just not right now. It's Ali's time. Boy, who would have ever dreamed that, Foreman would come back, what was he, 46? The oldest heavyweight champion ever. Bundini called it. Or Shorty called it.
So I want to ask, what is in the book for those of us who know very little about boxing?
Yeah, really, to be honest, I'm okay with people saying this isn't a boxing book. To be honest, this is about history. To follow Bundini's path in life, you have to go back to Jim Crow, Florida. You got to look at the time period in the Navy's history where African Americans or Black folks were not treated so great. You got to go through the Harlem Renaissance with Bundini. He's there hanging out with James Baldwin and these prominent figures of the Harlem Renaissance. Then you get to follow him through the 70s in the blaxploitation genre. I mean, really, it's a story about American culture. It's about families. It's about relationships. There's philosophy in there. There's a lot in there that really isn't necessarily boxing. So if anyone wants to call it a book that's outside the sphere of a boxing book, I'm okay with that.
We have one here for Taryn. What's the greatest lesson you learned from your grandfather?
God, there's so many, and there's so many that came down through my dad that at the time, of course, I didn't realize they were my grandfather, but I think they go to just how to take something that happens in your life that's negative and flip it and make it work for you. And the first lesson came from when I was in junior high and I was a cheerleader. I was the captain of my cheerleading team. And I went out for the high school varsity team and I got cut. And I came home, really upset, crying to my dad. They cut me from cheerleading. I'm not going to be a cheerleader in high school. And he looks at me, he's like, well, Taryn, let's make them cheer for you. Let's go back in the backyard. I'll teach how to play basketball. And those girls are now going to be cheering for you. And, not really understanding what's happening at the time, but that's exactly what ended up happening. I became a basketball player and, ended up getting a scholarship to University of Texas, playing at Texas and, playing all three sports and having cheerleaders cheer for me. And so I think that's the lesson. It's like something negative happens and you turn that around. And another thing my mom reminded me of is how my grandfather is, he was just someone who spoke things into existence. Like, he would say, this is what's going to happen, or this is what's happening. And all of a sudden that would actually occur. He would manifest. And that's what all the great spiritual teachers and leaders, they do. And my dad did the same thing for me, just when I was looking for a job and during the Great Recession, he's like, Taryn, you have the job. You're going to be an associate at a big law firm. You're going to be an associate. And I'm like, Dad, no, I'm not. Like, you don't understand what's going on. I would yell at my dad. And every day he would call me and we would talk. He'd be like, oh, you're an associate at the law firm. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm, still have no money and I'm broke and I'm, pounding the pavement. And then, a few months later, I was an associate at a law firm at a time where I should not have been. It's just that's my grandfather coming through. And my dad's like, Taryn, that's your grandfather. That's, of course I'm the one doing it, but it's coming through my dad. That's how my dad treated me. And it's that sort of thinking, and it's very strange because it's something, you know, those are things that should not happen. They're deep, and it's, you know, having the universe conspire to work for you.
Now, Taryn, I want you to tell a story on Rhoda, who is Drew's Bundini's wife, about charging your batteries, because I charged mine in the sun today.
Yeah, that is, oh my gosh, Todd, I'm so glad you brought that up. That's my best memories of my grandmother is when Drew, my brother and I, we would hold our grandmother's hand. We would be outside and we would look in the sun, and all three of us would hold hands and close our eyes. And Grandma Rhoda was like, we're charging our batteries. And we just sit there and have the sun, you know, take in the sun and charge our batteries. And to this day, I'll go outside and I charge my batteries, and it's so true. And that's just like again, deep connected person my grandmother was. And she was dead serious about charging those batteries by being in the sun. And oh gosh, she was such a wonderful person. But yeah.
It's been a crazy day for me today, so I had to charge my batteries. I was like,
yeah, you do. You gotta go out there and charge those batteries.
Okay, let's see. Okay, someone asked, did you find any activism work or political activity from Bundini that you didn't expect?
That's a good question. You know, I would call him an activist in some ways because, you know, during the champ's early reign as heavyweight champion of the world, you know, there were still colored-only restaurants, and him and the champ would drive up and down the East Coast, and there would be certain restaurants that weren't integrated, and he would just go right in. He did not care, and he knew what was going to happen, but he would just walk right in and say, hey, I'm with the champ of the world. And sometimes they would let him eat, sometimes they kicked him out, but he was very much, you know, someone who didn't care much for the rules. You know, he was not concerned with that. I mean, you got to think, he married a white Jewish woman at a time where that was sort of unheard of in American culture. He could care less what the standards were. What was right to him, and what was wrong was wrong. And one of my favorite phrases, he said, there are two kinds of people in the world, and it has nothing to do with race. It's good people and bad people, and it doesn't take you long to know the difference. And, you know, I think he was an activist in some ways because he had to sort of go into those spaces that he wasn't welcome in, and he would just say, you're going to have to tell me I'm not welcome. I'm going to make you either, you know, and he would win people over. He would talk his way into those spaces sometimes.
What about Ali's activism? Did that affect, how did that affect Bundini? You know,
well, I do know that when Ali was on his college tour, when he was going around the nation doing those college speeches, you know, some of the Bundini was with him, especially when he was in the New York area. He was with him for that stuff. I mean, he was there with him the day he turned himself in for, you know, refusing to be inducted into the draft. Drew was with him there when, you know, he was there in his corner for that too. I mean, very much he was there with him for all of those moments too. He was that a part of Ali's life outside of boxing for sure.
See, Katie from Facebook on Facebook asked, do you think people today could learn from the Ali Bundini relationship?
Wow, yeah. I think that the takeaway for me is you have to have those people in your life who can tell you the hard truth. You know what I mean? It's not always easy. And sometimes, you know, there's friction at first, but then you know, you're glad that that person was honest with you, you know. And I think to be successful in anything, you got to be able to take criticism. To be successful in anything, you got to have someone who has your back, because, you know, we have ups and downs no matter who you are. I don't care if you're Muhammad Ali or Michael Jordan, you got to have someone in your life who can tell you the truth. And I think that's really a big part of what he was for Ali. He was a sounding board to reality, because think about it. No matter where the champ went, everyone laughed at his jokes. He was the most handsome, most greatest fighter ever. He wasn't just great. People called him the greatest. And, you know, you have to have someone in your life who can be real with you. You got to have that person. And, you know, after I wrote the book, I thought to myself, you got to keep those people close. You know, you got to keep those people close to you who can be honest with you and know and love you for who you are, not just what you accomplish. And that's who he was for the champ.
We have Patrick from Facebook asks, does Drew Brown deserve, you might have touched on this a little bit, deserve a more prominent role in the narrative of hip hop history?
Oh, absolutely. It's a huge, tremendous, big research gap. I mean, because not only was he responsible for some of those rhymes that Ali was saying, and the most famous, sort of signifier, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee. Not only was he a part of that, he was a part of the jazz scene, which is a precursor to hip hop. He was a part of the blaxploitation genre, which was really, I think, the cultural medium that burst down the door for hip hop. There couldn't have been hip hop without the Shaft movies and without Ali, speaking the way he did in society and bringing pride to people with his bravado and his lyricism and his brashness. That combination was a perfect storm that led to the foundation of hip hop. And I very much want to resurrect Bundini's place in hip hop history. When we say hype man, we don't mean that in a negative term. We mean he was the guy there to keep you spiritually motivated and keep you sort of at your peak performance. That term originally is a positive signifier.
Question from Mike Madden, the owner of the camp.
Hey, Mike.
Did Bundini give many interviews that are still on video?
You know what? I have to give a lot of credit. We did a mini film in conjunction with the book.
Right, it's great, yeah.
The director is a guy named Patrick Green from Los Angeles. And I thought I had done all of my work that I could do as far as interviews. He found some stuff that never been released for our, if you haven't seen it, check it out on YouTube. He found interviews with Bundini and Customato. He found interviews with Bundini and Howard Cosell. There really isn't much, but we've tried to dig up in that documentary as much as we could possibly find. He was someone who really, believe it or not, wasn't that interested in the camera. I asked his son, I asked Drew one day, I said, your dad seems a little grouchy in some of these interviews. Like if you watch the 30 for 30 about Fighter 7, he seems a little grouchy.
Right.
And he said he didn't like, he didn't like being put on camera. He always felt like they were trying to trick him up or, get him to say something. So yeah, he didn't like doing interviews. He only did them when he had to. Of course, he did some big ones. Like when Ali was injured before their Liston rematch, he sent Bundini out to do the interviews. And of course, he does some interviews after the Frazier loss. So he was sort of Ali's publicist at times, but they're tough to find. It was a task, and I give Patrick Green all the credit for digging deep into the annals of YouTube and the internet to find those things.
Yeah, as someone asked here, where can we find the documentary that Patrick made? And YouTube, right?
You can just go to YouTube and type in Bundini, Don't Believe the Hype. We have our trailer in the 22-minute documentary. It's wonderfully produced.
Yeah, Patrick did a terrific job of that. Yeah.
One heck of a good filmmaker. What did you think of the doc, Taryn?
I was blown away. I thought it was just a beautifully shot and the creative. I thought it captured the essence of the time in such a very cool, edgy way. I was blown away. I thought it was a beautiful documentary. I encourage everyone to take a look at it. It's worth
super good. And I will say that some of those things that Patrick found I hadn't found in my research, and I'd been probably half a year into writing this book, and he found stuff that quick. So wow. He's good at what he does. I don't know how he did it.
Someone asked, what would Bundini think of today's America, politically and socially, if he were still alive?
His famous phrase was blue eyes and brown eyes see grass green. And, he was the kind of person, he believed in one race, the human race. And he believed in, we have our cultural differences, we have our ethnicities, but he believed in, like the old adage I said earlier, there's good people and bad people. And if we're good to each other, we're one race, the human race. In some ways, researching Bundini's past, some of the racial things he had to go through, the segregation stuff, the blatant racism that he incurred in the Navy, it has some positive messages for today. We're in a tough time right now, and I think those subtexts are in the book as well. And that's part of the conversation. Is he and Ali were on the right side of history. They had different viewpoints and different ways about it, but they were certainly on the right side of history. And seeing the differences in their reaction to racism and racial injustice was interesting to me because they approached it from different perspectives for sure.
Yeah, I think he would have been so proud of today's young people for standing up in what they believe in and protesting and just people, leading that charge, and then people everywhere around the world coming together for one cause, for racial justice. I think you'd just be so proud of people for that. And he was the epitome of inclusion and diversity, and you know, and our family is the byproduct of that. Just having you know, Jewish grandparents, Creole Catholic grandparents, you know, my dad being a mixed race, mixed religions, but you know, and like Todd said, my grandfather, who's huge on we're all one race, we're the, you know, the human race, but also seeing the beauty in diversity and having those differences about us. And I think that just the division he would be so upset about, like just seeing that people are against each other. And he was also how Shorty came about is that he said, you know, some people are pushing the shortest man, pushing the shortest man away in order to get to the front of the church, you know, to you know, show how great they are. Just you're pushing people aside. And our president, you know, that's one of the things he did to the president of Montenegro. He just pushed him aside to get in the front. And so the whole point is you don't push people away. You don't just push people who are less, who you think are lesser than you, or who you think are less valuable. You include everybody. You include all people and of all walks of life. And I'll say just one last story, which about this topic that just shows how inclusive my grandfather was. For my dad's bar mitzvah, his cousin was had Down syndrome, and he wasn't a close cousin, but he was a cousin, was invited to bar mitzvah. And at the end, everyone's taking the important bar mitzvah pictures, and my grandfather's there, and my grandfather made sure that cousin was in every single important bar mitzvah picture. And he, you know, when my dad were going through the book, it's like, oh, who's that? It's like, oh, you know, Granddaddy Jew would not have it, because that's the whole point of making everyone feel special, make them feel included. You see the best in them, and it doesn't matter who you are. You know, you are with us, and you're one of us. And I think that goes to, it would be great if society and, you know, politics would see that today, that we're all connected and we're all one.
Yeah, well said.
So someone asked where we can buy the book. Is it sold just on Amazon or everywhere books are sold?
Yeah, it's released in the U.S. today, so anywhere books are sold. But you can go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble, the Hamilcar page. It'll be out in the UK on Thursday, so this is going to be out there in the world. I'm so excited for people to read these stories, because a lot of them I don't think anyone's ever heard if you're not a part of the inner circle. So yeah, it's out everywhere today via Hamilcar, so you can check it out. Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere they sell books.
Support your local bookstore, right? Too.
That's right. Yeah. That's what I should have said. I named the big chain, right? I mean, what I meant to say was go to your local bookstore and, you know, buy local. That's right, because that's what I do.
Let's see if we have any more. Well, I guess that'll just about conclude our event for tonight. On behalf of Fighters Heaven and Hannibal Boxing, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Our special thanks to our guest, Taryn Brown, and of course, Todd.
Thank you.
Be sure to pick up a copy of his book. It's worthwhile. It's a wonderful book. You don't have to be a boxing fan to enjoy it. It's just fascinating and an inspiring story, I think, of a very interesting man. We wish you much success with it, Todd.
Yeah, you're part of the story too, Jeff. Man, I appreciate all the help you gave me along the way. So thank you.
My pleasure.
Yes. And Jeff, when can we visit Fighters Heaven?
Fighters Heaven is open on weekends now through the end of October, 10 to 5, or during the week by appointment. Just log on to fightersheaven.com and you can get in touch. There's info at fightersheaven.com. You can set up an appointment. We have a Facebook page and Instagram page. We'd like to invite everyone to, if they get a chance, to visit Fighters Heaven, because, and this is a historic site where Bundini and Ali and the whole crew, you know, they spent a lot of their time here.
Yeah, there's nothing like it. Nothing like it.
And thanks to the efforts of Mike Madden, who bought it shortly after Ali died in 2016, it's been restored to the way it was when Ali trained here. And our goal is to help keep Ali's legacy alive, to remind some and educate others what an inspirational life he had. So we're working hard at trying to do that. We hope everyone can make it here someday. That's fightersheaven.com.
Great. I can't wait to visit.
I hope you do.
I'll be back, Jeff.
Yes.
Thank you so
Yeah.
much for everything.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Okay.
Good night, guys.
Bye.